It was Thursday night in Safety Harbor, Florida. The name promises protection, and Nikki Halpin believed in that promise. A front yard with oak trees, a kid's bathroom with extra towels, a best friend coffee date every Friday morning. The kind of place where porch lights stay on and neighbors swap school pickup favors. But on a cool January night at 9:30 p.m., an engineer named Chris is booting up his desktop computer when a ping goes off and something pops up. A message, just 2 letters, HB. It's from his girlfriend, Nikki, who just literally dropped him off. Before he can figure out what it meant, his phone rang. It was Nikki. Only this time, all he hears is a scream, a thud, and the sound of someone else in her house. So he dials 911, but he gives them the wrong address. And when deputies knock on the door 2 houses down, 2 little boys in Nikki's house will learn in seconds what the word fear truly means. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. And if you have never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. And guess what? It is about to be spooky season. You can see I have a couple decorations. I've got the big spider. I've got the little baby spider back there and a little pumpkin. But it also means limited time seasonal things, even in my favorite mobile game, which is June's Journey, who is sponsoring today's video. And it is a free to download hidden object mystery game where you act like a detective. And it's perfect. It combines a thrilling murder mystery story, and you have to use your attention to detail to uncover hidden clues. But what's special is that June's Journey is turning 8 this year, and it's a spooky-versary. So as usual, there will be lots of special events happening like Halloween surprises the entire month of October, and even a thrilling mystery left just for you by June herself. Now, I can't wait personally for the Halloween decor. It's my favorite time to play, and you can play an exclusive in-game event to get rare decorations and powerful game bonuses. You can decorate your island with special Halloween-themed set inspired by Gothic elegance. And plus, the more you play, the more resources you get to transform your island into a haunted Halloween fantasy. Yes, please. So take part in this interactive community challenge and help solve the mystery that June left for you 100 years ago. And you can watch the video series on June's Journey YouTube channel with a possibility that you could win exclusive in-game rewards. And I'm really excited for you to download June's Journey for free on Android and iOS mobile devices and your PC. All you have to do is click the link below in my description box or scan the QR code right on the screen. And once again, I want to thank June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. And I want to give a big thank you to all of you who watch my videos, who subscribe to my channel. I cannot believe I recently hit 500,000 subscribers. I never ever thought I would get there. That has been my dream. I've never even dreamt of 1 million. For some reason, 500,000 has always been the number I have been waiting for. And now it's here because of all of you. And I just want to also say thank you for giving me those moments for our sponsors, because it means a lot, especially when I got sick the last few weeks. I know a lot of you were looking for updates. And if you ever want to know what's going on with me, you can always follow me on Instagram. I'll put all that below. But you can also look on my community posts here on YouTube if you don't want to leave this app. I also have a completely free tier on my Patreon where you can get constant updates. Some you might not even want, because I'll do like 11-minute voice messages like I'm your BFF. But trust me, anytime I don't post, it affects me more than anyone else. This is my dream. This is what I want to do. I don't bulk record videos. I'm a weekly writer, editor, poster as of now. So I just want to thank all of you for caring about me and also understanding that I am human. But by the way, I'm going to make this quick. At the end of this video, I do have a special sneak peek for you in case you want to know some of the other things I have in the works. So wait till the end and you will see a little sneak peek video. And yes, it's a new channel and you're probably like, Kimber, you can't even keep up with the ones you have. Don't worry. I'll get back in my groove. I'll promise you that. But this is for people who want to watch and listen to me, but maybe not true crime, but something, adjacent to true crime. So I would love for you to check it out. But let's get serious and let's go back to Clearview Drive in Safety Harbor, Florida on January 8th of 2004. It was around 9:30 p.m. Nikki Halpin is a mother of 2 boys. Max is 9 and Drew is 7. And their nightly routine consisted of homework, video games, and settling in with a bedtime story or a bath. And while everything seemed completely normal, that night it wasn't. And the first clue that something was off was that message. It was just 2 letters, HB, on Instant Messenger. And it came from Nikki's profile to her boyfriend, Chris. Of course, he's confused. But before he could figure it out, his phone rang. And it was Nikki. But when he picks it up, all he could hear was chaos. And imagine for a minute hearing the person that you love screaming and struggling and knowing that she has her 2 young children with her and they're all alone. And there's nothing you can do to save them. That is what poor Chris was going through. But you don't know anything about Chris or how he and Nikki met or why he lives in a different house than her and the 2 boys. So of course, I'm going to fill you in. Niccole Virginia Gaume. Everyone called her Nikki. She came into the world on June 20th of 1971 in Virginia to her mom, Laureen, who went by Lori, and her father, Nelson Gaume. But she didn't stay there long. Her real roots grew in Acton, Massachusetts. It's a small town with that classic New England feel to it. Old houses, good schools, and a tight-knit community. Nikki was the oldest of 2 daughters. She had a younger sister, Jennifer, that was 3 years younger than she was. And Nikki was a good baby, a happy baby, always smiling and giggling, the almond-shaped brown eyes and the brown hair that her mom cut into a short bob with bangs. That was the style. I swear I had the same haircut, and you probably did too as a child. And if you have been the oldest sibling, you know what it means, responsibility. People said that Nikki came out of the womb knowing how to take charge. Nikki was the one telling her little sister what to do. She would organize games. She would boss everyone around in a cute, lovable way, of course, that only the firstborn can. Her personality was magnetic from the beginning. And while her sister Jennifer was quiet and shy and reserved, Nikki was the complete opposite. She was bubbly, social, the type of kid who could walk into a room full of complete strangers and leave with 5 new friends. Her sister was the opposite in looks as well. Jennifer had hazel eyes and curlier hair. And it's funny how that happens. Even with the same parents, siblings can look so different. Nikki wasn't afraid to speak up, and people loved that about her. She had a laugh that made other people laugh, and she had this kind of energy, and I know you've met people like this. They just make you want to do whatever it is they're doing. She was a born leader. A lot of firstborns are. But Nikki wasn't just all about having fun. She was smart, dedicated, and her mom, Lori, noticed very early on how studious Nikki really was. In middle school, she would come home with her books, she would sit down, and she would do her homework without any direction from her parents whatsoever. And she had that drive to learn and to succeed. And her mom probably thought, okay, she's going to be going places. This is the serious one. This is the one who always has her nose in a book. The one that is going to go really far in her life, maybe even be a doctor or a lawyer, the president of the United States, because parents usually dream big for their little ones before their little ones can even have those kind of dreams, and they push them. But then, in Nikki's case, high school happened. And if you grew up in the 80s or early 90s like me, then you would know that high school was an entire different universe of its own. And wow, do I miss that? You hate it when you're in it, and then you wish you could go back there once it's over. I think what made it so great was there was no cell phones, no social media. Your reputation was built in the hallways and at football games, not on Instagram or on TikTok. And Nikki walked into Acton High School with all the confidence in the world. And while I told you that she started off studious, she did in high school as well, except for when boys got into the picture. It was game over. Nikki was officially boy crazy, and either we were that girl or we knew that girl. Posters of New Kids on the Block or maybe Brad Pitt taped up on our walls, giggling with our best friends, passing notes folded into those perfect little triangles. Do you remember those? And calling crushes from family landlines and hoping that parents didn't answer. That was Nikki's vibe in high school. She was outgoing. She was very flirty. That's what her friend said. A really big flirt, but fun-loving. She wanted the full teenage experience, and she was making sure that she got it every moment. It's one of the only times in our lives when we can be really carefree, because after high school, a lot of people get more serious about life. Usually that's due to college. And after graduating from Acton High School in 1989, Nikki went on to the University of Massachusetts. It was her first real step into adulthood. And college in the late 80s and early 90s was a different kind of freedom. Again, without social media, you didn't know what college was like. You might have seen it on TV or read about it, but this was a whole new experience. You can think about the big dorm rooms, the phones, big campus quads, scrunchies, oversized sweaters, and late night pizza. And Nikki was excited about what was next in her life. She wasn't just book smart anymore. She was ambitious. She wanted to start building a real life for herself, mostly because her top goal, according to her mother, was to make money. When she graduated and went back home, she got a job working at a local bank. And that's a pretty good place if you want to be at least around a lot of money, right? But also possibly be around clients at the bank who had money. Handsome clients. That would be a plus. And I'm only saying that because, well, on paper, it's a normal job. But this is actually where Nikki's life shifted in a huge way, because this is where she met her future husband, Donald Halpin. And if you're thinking gold digger, just wait, because I've heard the phrase, all women are expensive, so pick the one in your price range. And I am kind of joking, but it wasn't really a gold digger thing for Nikki. This was a stability thing for her. She knew what she wanted. And after Don came into the bank that day, Nikki could not wait to call her mother and tell her how handsome this man was. 22-year-old Nikki tells her mom, I just met a man who looks like the Terminator. We're talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger, and this was the peak 90s Arnold. Not the governor, not the older guy that you see today, but the buff movie star. Nikki saw Don and was smitten. He had these big crystal blue eyes, he was tan, and she told her mom he was wearing a uniform that looked like he was a police officer. He was actually a prison guard, and Nikki was impressed. But there was one thing that could be concerning to some people. Don was 41. He was almost 20 years older than Nikki. But again, stability is important. And she told her friends she liked that Don had a good job, that he wasn't immature like younger guys, and he wanted a family, which was something that Nikki really wanted as well. She could not wait to get married. However, Don had already been there, done that multiple times. Don had already been married and divorced several times and had children of his own from previous relationships. So of course, this history of unsuccessful unions and existing family commitments added another layer of complexity. But as Nikki got to know Don more and more, she really looked past all that, even though her loved ones did not. They thought about all the emotional baggage that Don may bring into a relationship and how all of that would impact Nikki's life. Nikki's mom definitely had a different version for her daughter's future, and Don just wasn't who she pictured with Nikki. But remember that since Nikki was little, she was the boss. She was going to make her own decisions, and she was determined to get what she wanted regardless of what other people thought. And she was an adult who could make those decisions for herself. So despite people's doubts or criticism they gave her, Nikki decided to go forward and date Don exclusively. And it only took about 6 months of them being together, and Nikki was ready to take it to the next level, to get married. She gathered her family around and announced that she and Don were engaged. And for someone in the early 20s, you can just imagine how big that was. Getting married young, that's already pretty huge. But there's more. Only 1 month later, Nikki found out she was pregnant. And all along, she was sitting there thinking that she couldn't even have children. I don't know the specifics or the reasons, but she had been convinced that it would never happen for her, so this was a big dream come true. Their wedding day came in 1994, and it was something right out of a storybook. The couple chose a quaint little chapel in Massachusetts, and Nikki had a little twist to her wedding. She was running late, but not by a few minutes. She showed up a whole hour after the ceremony was supposed to start. And how did she arrive? in a horse-drawn carriage, full-on princess mode. And guests said she looked radiant, she was glowing, and it was like she was stepping straight into the life she'd always wanted. Her wedding dress was absolutely gorgeous. It had those 80s puffy sleeves, and the neckline was just beautiful. It was low, and it came down and then came up around her neck like a little collar. It was a traditional satin white gown with a beaded veil, and it was just absolutely breathtaking. They looked like a beautiful couple. She was about to be 3 months pregnant at the time, so this wasn't just a wedding day. It was the start of her family. After they tied the knot, Nikki leaned all the way into motherhood. Her sister said it was like a switch just flipped. Nikki went into mom mode. She decorated the nursery, she baby-proofed the house, and she was reading book after book on parenting. She wasn't just excited to be a mom, she was obsessed, and she wanted to do it right. That November, on the 21st, right before Thanksgiving, Nikki gave birth to her first son, Max. He was beautiful, but his start in life was not easy. Max was born with hydrocephalus. It's a condition where fluid builds up in the brain. And I did do another case on this channel where we did have a victim give birth to a child with the very same condition. So I'm a little bit familiar about how devastating this is. But Nikki was determined to fight for her child, even though they told her he might not even live very long. Max, who they ended up calling Miracle Max, survived all odds. But this meant long nights sitting by his side in a hospital and 39 brain surgeries. I can't even begin to imagine. It's not easy raising a baby with special needs, but everyone knew if anyone could handle the challenge, it would be Nikki. She was so strong. She was so determined to give Max the best quality of life possible. But as many of you can possibly imagine, and I know some of you can because you are living it with your own family, this was hard on her. It was hard on her and Dawn's relationship as well. You're caring for a child that needs to be looked after around the clock. It's also hard for you to be there for your partner. And Dawn was trying to be very supportive. Nikki was a loving and incredible mother. Max was nonverbal, and Nikki did everything she could to communicate with him, to teach him how to communicate in his own way. She taught him sign language, and surprisingly, he caught on. And he was finally able to relay his needs to her. And then another surprise. Max eventually started to speak, something they didn't even think was possible or was ever going to happen. And there was something else going on this whole time. Nikki was pregnant, and she gave birth to her second son, Drew, when Max was 2 years old. With such a blessing also came a tragic turn of events. While Max was being treated at a routine appointment, now she's caring for the newborn, she's still going to all these doctor's appointments. The doctors gave Max the wrong medication for his hydrocephalus. And this made his condition so much worse. He was already in a very fragile state, and now he was struggling even more. And this error led Nikki and Dawn to actually pursue legal action against this hospital in a lawsuit. That's a lot to happen in a very short amount of time. Max took up a lot of Nikki's time, but that did not mean that she did not give everything she could to her baby Drew. She was attentive to the entire family and always put her family's needs first. She was the children's biggest advocate. She was the mom marching down to the school, making sure that they had programs to help Max so that he could learn and get his needs met, so that he could have the best chance for his future. The whole time, they were still living in Massachusetts. But when Drew turned 3, the family decided to make a big move. The truth is that things had been really stressful on Dawn and Nikki, and their relationship wasn't the best. They were getting into a lot of arguments, mostly about things like finances or the kids or the time they weren't spending together. And they thought that maybe if they possibly moved somewhere else, away from the bitter cold and into the warmer climate in Florida, this was supposed to be better for Max's health. And they figured if everything went well, they could have a fresh start and maybe things would work out. So at the end of 1999, they moved to Safety Harbor, Florida, to a house at 15 Clearview Drive, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 2,200 square foot single-family home on the end of a cul-de-sac. This was a great area to raise children, and it was by a park. It had a pool in the backyard. It didn't have any rear neighbors, a big living room, vaulted ceilings, a 2-car garage, and a 28-acre lot. It was perfect. It was right off the edge of Safety Harbor, a body of water adjacent to Old Tampa Bay. Safety Harbor is in Pinellas County, Florida, right near Tampa. When Nikki chose Safety Harbor as a fresh start, it wasn't just another Florida town. The name alone made it feel like destiny, safety. A harbor, a place that promised calm and stability and protection. This little town sat tucked along the west shore of Tampa Bay, and the population was just over 17,000 people. Not sprawling, not urban, but not so tiny that you feel cut off from the world. It had that small town Florida vibe. People waved when they drove by your house, the grocery store cashier knew your kids' names, and if you missed trash pickup, your neighbor might actually drag your bin back up for you. The houses were a mix. Some were old Florida ranch-style homes with screened-in porches and pastel paint, and others like Nikki's was more New England-inspired, with oak and maple trees shading the yard. Nikki loved those trees because they reminded her of Massachusetts. Safety Harbor had streets that felt cozy. They were lined with sidewalks where kids actually rode their bikes. People left their windows open on breezy days, and it was the kind of place where you didn't just know your neighbors, but you actually trusted them. In the early 2000s, crime was really low. In Pinellas County, where Safety Harbor is located, it had crime, sure, but mostly in the busier parts of town like Clearwater or St. Petersburg. But Safety Harbor was different. It was the kind of place people chose on purpose to raise their families or go to retire. And if you looked at the crime stats back then, you mostly saw minor things, a car break-in, maybe a teenager's prank, a bar scuffle, but home invasions and violent crime, practically unheard of. People kept their doors unlocked, literally. That's how much trust was in this community. The culture was very Florida small town. Moms pushing strollers down Main Street, stopping at little boutiques. And on the weekends, you'd find people fishing off the pier and families spread out on blankets in the park. I say all this because I want to really paint a picture of what it was like to live there at the time. It was the type of place that even during the evenings when it got dark, the kids could run around outside after dinner and play flashlight tag. And the parents wouldn't even worry because everyone they knew were decent people. They were good people. And that's exactly why Nikki thought she was doing her very best when her family bought a house there. After the chaos of the hospital visits, carrying the weight of her world on her shoulders, she truly hoped that this would mend things. There was no way to know that Nikki's new home would soon become the scene of a nightmare. Things were good when they moved. I think anything new feels great until the novelty wears off. And the arguments between her and Don, they didn't stop. Don had retired from his corrections job, so now Nikki was working about 40 hours a week. And it was a lot. She would complain that Don really wasn't pulling his weight anymore. For example, she would come home from work, and Don would have been there all day long, and she would notice that the chores weren't even done. The sink was piled high with dishes, and everything was a mess, and it just wasn't working out. So Don started doing a night job as a bartender. And with that job came late hours, and eventually he started to drink. The man Nikki had once been so excited about was slipping into habits that left her carrying the load alone. She was the one working, providing, cleaning, holding it all together. And by 2001, it was too much. The marriage cracked under the weight of Don's drinking and his absence. He wasn't there for the boys, and he wasn't the man Nikki had married. So they decided to separate. And Nikki filed for divorce. And by 2003, they were officially done, with Nikki granted primary custody of the boys. Luckily, she did have a support system because right when she moved to Safety Harbor, she clicked with one of her neighbors, Kim Scoff. And the two of them met because their youngest children went to Plum Elementary School together. Kim had 2 daughters, and they were around Nikki's son's ages. Nikki and Kim started doing everything together. They would drop the kids off and have their morning coffee chit-chat. And they would talk about their life and their stresses, their hopes and their dreams. And it wasn't long before they weren't just best friends. They were as close as sisters. And they had a circle of friends to hang out with on a regular basis. Nikki had confided in her friends that the entire time her and Don were going through their struggles, Nikki could not wait to get divorced. Kim was divorced, and her life as a single mom, it didn't look bad at all. It looked like freedom, like fun, And soon Nikki and Kim were having fun together. Both of them were single, they would get sitters, and they would go out and mingle. They had a routine where every Friday night, the two of them would go out dancing together. It was all about the two of them having a really good time, laughing, going dancing. It wasn't to meet men and date. And I think everyone needs that time to themselves away from their little ones, because then you come back and you're rejuvenated in a way. You let loose, you have fun, and then back to the weekly grind again. Now there's something else. Remember that lawsuit that I told you about, where the hospital from where Max was an infant gave him the wrong meds? Well, that same year, the hospital settled a malpractice suit, and Nikki and Dawn were awarded $1.5 million, which was placed in a trust for Max's care. Because Nikki had custody of Max, the court made her the trustee. She was in charge of that money. The decision was based on the belief that Nikki would act in Max's best interest and ensure that the funds would be used appropriately for his care and upbringing, his education, for the rest of his life. And she took that responsibility very seriously. This woman wasn't reckless. She was making sure that Max's life and future were secure. And that brings us to a turning point in Nikki's life. She's now a single mom, raising two boys, starting over. Nikki leaned all the way into creating a home. She decorated, she landscaped, she turned the yard into a place where her boys could play. She wanted it to feel stable, not just for them, but also for her. When you've lived in hospitals, lawyers' offices, and tense courtrooms, a cozy little house in a quaint town feels like heaven. She loved it there. But it wasn't all about fun. Nikki's days were very full, and they revolved around her boys. Max still had health challenges, and Nikki gave everything that she could to help him. She was his advocate, his teacher, his cheerleader, and Drew, his younger brother, was healthy and full of energy. So Nikki had to balance both of their worlds. And people admired that about her. She was the mom who showed up at school events, decorated for the holidays, who gave her children as much normal as she possibly could in the middle of chaos. She looked forward to her sacred Friday nights, though, when she had a chance to shake off the stress of the week. The doctor's appointments, the grind, the never-ending responsibilities. For a few hours, she wasn't Nikki, the single mom. She was just Nikki. She could laugh, she could dance, and she could just let go of all the heaviness. Now, all of that brings me to the fact that even though she wasn't looking for a guy, she was the type of person that was fun and bubbly and outgoing, and she had a really good sense of humor, and guys would naturally be drawn to her. So there was no lack of men coming up to her on Friday nights and wanted to dance with her, wanted to spend time with her, and she wouldn't always brush them off. She still believed that maybe she could fall in love again. After all, Nikki was only in her early 30s. She pictured that someday she would find someone who she could share her life with, someone who would adore her boys. So she began going in online chat rooms. Remember those? I think it's kind of a version of what social media is today. You don't see a person's face. They just have a profile name, and you have to trust that they are who they say they are. And you start to get to know them. And eventually, if you click, maybe you would meet in person. Well, Nikki was doing that and connecting with people there, and she would also connect with people when she and Kim went out. She began casually dating here and there, and there were also a few more serious guys. So I will tell you about a couple of the more permanent fixtures so that you have a timeline and a history. First, there was Daniel Welch, the blue-eyed 31-year-old that did HVAC, air conditioning repairs, and he had a steady career. He was fun, and he and Nikki had really great chemistry. And because of that, she decided to spend more time with him. One of the reasons Nikki was drawn to Dan was because of his bond with her two children. As a loving mother, it was crucial for Nikki to find a partner who would accept her children and embrace them as his own. And Dan proved to be a figure in their lives. He would effortlessly connect with the boys, and for a while it seemed promising. But Nikki and even her friends started to notice that she seemed more into Dan than Dan was into her. And that's always such a disappointment. Dan just wasn't matching her energy when it came to commitment. And after 2 years, the boys are now 8 and 6, and Nikki felt like she was putting a lot of time into this relationship, so she kind of gave Dan a little nudge. She was telling him she wanted more in the relationship. It was one of those things where it was like, look, if we don't want the same things, we're not getting any younger, so either we move it to the next level, or Nikki had to move on and find someone that was on her same timeline. And unfortunately, Dan wasn't the one. And it was truly painful. I mean, when you have children and somebody met a man in your life, the breakup is harder because there's that extra layer because your kids are involved. But Nikki was resilient. She wasn't going to settle for someone who didn't truly want the life that she had to offer. Nikki picks herself up, she leans on her friends, and she starts over. And not long after, she met Chris Catano, a 32-year-old engineer. And they connected online through a dating site. They bonded over being from the North, and things moved into dating. He took her skiing, which Nikki loved because it was something that she hadn't done in years, but she'd grown up doing in Massachusetts. And that trip was so much fun. It felt easy. And it made her think that maybe this could be a new chapter. But everything was still very new. So there you have it. I gave you a background for now, and I want to jump to Thursday, January 8th of 2004. It's a new year. And Nikki has a new love in her life and a new sense of hope for the future. She and Chris decide to take Drew and Max out for dinner. And afterward, Nikki drops Chris off at his place, which is only about 15 minutes away. And then Nikki drives back home. Chris is getting settled in. He's going about his normal night routine, part of which means turning on his computer. This was the early 2000s. Remember that. Your computer didn't just wake up instantly. You had to wait for it. It would hum and then glow and turn on. Your instant message would pop up with all your buddies. Remember that? And just 5 minutes later, he hears a little ping from his instant messenger. And he goes to the screen and he's confused because it's from Nikki's profile. But that's weird because she just left his house. She would still be on her way home. All the message said was HB, just 2 letters. And Chris was like, okay, did she mean to type hi? He was curious, so he responded asking Nikki if she'd blown through every red light to get home so fast. And then several minutes later, Chris gets another message from Nikki's profile, and she clarifies. She never typed the first message, the one with just HB, and says she'll call Chris in a moment to discuss. Now that's odd. Nikki calls Chris a few minutes later, and she's trying to explain something isn't right. She's like, there may be someone inside my house or something because I did not write that message on Instant Messenger. Chris was trying to be logical about the whole thing and calm Nikki down. Maybe something fell on her keyboard. Maybe those letters got stuck or something, who knows? But Nikki didn't feel safe. And then out of nowhere, Chris heard a blood-curdling scream from his girlfriend and then rustling around like there was some kind of struggle going on, and he didn't know what to think. He knew that Nikki's son had medical issues, so his first thought was maybe Max was in a medical emergency. Chris was on his landline but had a cell phone, so he picks it up while he's still on the phone with Nikki and he calls 911. Imagine being Chris in that moment. You're sitting at your desk, you're listening to the woman that you just had dinner with scream for her life, someone you care about, someone you just started dating. When the dispatcher came on the line and asked what was happening, Chris explained he was on the phone with his girlfriend and started hearing screaming and a lot of noise, and he has no idea what's going on. As the dispatcher is asking Chris questions, he doesn't know if he should try to drive over there or what. The dispatcher was like, well, wait a minute. Does she have another number we could call that I could call her on and see what's going on and maybe she'll answer? And he said, yeah, she has a cell phone. So they want to see if she'll try to pick up that line while the other one's still open with Chris on it. The dispatcher tries to call Nikki's cell phone, but she doesn't answer. And Chris is getting more frantic because there's now silence on the line with Nikki. And he's calling her name over and over again. And the dispatcher tells him she's sending over the police and asks for Nikki's address. Deputy Brad Ferguson from Pinellas County Sheriff's Office is on patrol that night. And he got that call that there was a disturbance in the Baywood neighborhood at 12 Clearview Road. But that's the wrong address. And this is so infuriating. I could not stand it. I couldn't take it. It's wrong. It was 2 houses down from Nikki's. And this deputy is on his way there while Nikki is in trouble in this wasted, precious time. Deputy Ferguson parks. He gets out. He knocks on 12 Clearview, and a man comes to the door. And you have to look at this from the perspective of this officer. He doesn't know if this resident is going to lie to him because the guy's like, oh, there's nothing going on here. And he's like, well, I have to speak to everyone in this house. And there were other females in that house. And one of them, I can't believe this, but it's true, happened to be named Niccole. So the officer had to speak to her to make sure that nothing strange was going on. And this got really confusing because Niccole is this teenage daughter living at 12 Clearview, and she's got a boyfriend that her family didn't like. So the deputy, who has limited information, is thinking that the boyfriend that's called 911 is this teenage girl's boyfriend. The father's trying to explain that the only disturbance they had was that they had told this boyfriend he wasn't welcome there. But none of this is relevant to Nikki at all. And it wasted so much time, all because Chris gave the wrong address. It was 15 Clearview, not 12. But to be fair, Chris hadn't been dating Nikki that long, so he got mixed up. Now, I have a portion of this 911 call, so I'll play it for you so you could get some context.
911, what's your emergency?
I'm on the line with the person right now. I heard his son screaming.
Okay, let me get you through the police.
Nikki, hello. I heard screaming. Nikki, sounds like somebody might be in the house.
This is so urgent, yet they don't have a clue what has happened inside that home at the end of the cul-de-sac. It took a few minutes. They walked around the house and nothing looked out of the ordinary. There was nothing obvious happening. The house was dark. No lights were even on inside. And then Drew and Max popped up from a window. And they looked terrified. They had been hiding. And the neighbor waved to them. He makes the motion towards the front door, telling them the cops were there and it's okay. They're there to help and to come open the door. Since they recognized the neighbor, they went and did as they were told. But this is where things become very terrifying and also heartbreaking. And this is what stuck with me. 7-year-old Drew answered the door and 9-year-old Max is right behind him. And right away, the officer notices blood on Max's shirt. And that was quite a sight to see. It startled Nikki's neighbor. However, neither one of the boys looked like they were physically harmed. And Officer Ferguson looks at them and he asks them, "Are you okay?" And they say yes. And then he says, "Where's your mommy?" And little Drew actually points back into the house and says, "Mommy is in her room and she's hurt." By this point, Officer Ferguson had already called for backup, so him and another officer enter the house. There's still Christmas decorations up, a little deer in the front of the house, snowmen, Christmas tree decals on the window in front. They move into the living room. There's new toys that were just recently unwrapped at Christmas, but not even taken out of boxes yet. These officers don't know if there's a threat still inside this home, so they have to clear every single room. They're walking through, and now they're in an office where you can see Christmas decorations were being put back into containers. It just looked like such a normal house and a normal existence, like it could be any of our homes. And by the way, Chris is still on the line with the dispatcher as officers are walking through this house, and he's still telling the dispatcher, "I think somebody could be in there. I could hear someone. It sounded like a struggle." So essentially, Chris is an ear witness to what happened inside that house that night. He was even on the line when the officers were knocking on the windows and things like that. And the dispatcher let him know help has arrived. And she actually instructed Chris to hang up with her and go meet the officers back in Nikki's house so that he could provide a detailed report. When the officers get to Nikki's bedroom, there's a whole bunch of laundry on her bed, which is folded in different piles. Her laptop is open and right on the top of her bed. And when I saw that photo, I could just imagine her sitting right there with her back up against the pillow, typing on that computer. But she's not sitting there. However, she is on that bed. She's on the far right-hand side of the bed, lying on her side in a pool of blood. And there is a lot of blood. It's spattered everywhere, and there's a pool right under her head. This officer can see that there is a severe trauma to the left side of her head. A cordless phone is right next to her body. And Officer Ferguson literally screamed out to the neighbor to please take the boys over to his house. He did not want them to see their mother in this condition. But I'm going to tell you right now, if that was his goal, it was too late. They had already witnessed so much. And what's crazy is that Nikki is still breathing, but she suffered a very brutal beating and she's barely hanging on. Officer Ferguson calls for medical assistance, and it only takes them mere minutes to arrive, and they decide they need to airlift her to the nearest hospital so they could treat her injuries, which was Bayfront Health in St. Petersburg, about 30 minutes away by car. This house is now a crime scene. And homicide detectives are called in, and they don't know whether Nikki is going to live or die at this point. Robert Snipes and veteran detective Ed Judy, who's been on the force for almost 20 years, pulls up to the house. Their job is to figure out who did this and what exactly happened. And they have Chris as an ear witness, but they also have 2 little boys that were inside that house. But the problem is you are dealing with children. So their recollection and the way that they perceive things is not going to be how an adult does. And they do not communicate. And especially Max, we know he does not communicate as much as Drew, the younger one, because Max is special needs. So these investigators have to focus on 7-year-old Drew. They know that they have to, but they don't want to traumatize this little boy, but he's ready. He wants to try to help them. First, they have to make sure that he understands the difference between a truth and a lie. And I've heard detectives explain this before, and that's important. Drew fully understood. He knew the difference, and he explained what happened that night. They got home from having pizza with their mom's boyfriend, Chris. And then after, they brought Chris back to his house, and they went back home. Drew got settled in by starting his homework at the dining room table, and Max and Nikki share a bedroom since she's got to be there for him in the middle of the night. And they go back in the bedroom, and Max starts playing a video game. The TV is on, and Mom is on her computer sitting in bed with Max. And this is probably when she noticed the instant message that said HB and then called Chris confused. So now we're getting a clearer picture of that night. Drew said everything was fine, Mommy was doing chores, and then he heard her scream and saw her running from another part of the house into her bedroom where Max was. And there was a man in black following close behind her with something silver in his hand. Now I have to pause for a minute because I can only imagine, and I don't even want to, but I can imagine how scared these little boys were. No one should have to witness this, especially very innocent children. Drew was asked what he thought the intruder had been holding, and he said he didn't know, but maybe it was a metal baseball bat. He just really couldn't tell, and he didn't know what the man looked like because he was wearing a mask. Later, they asked him to draw a picture of this mask. And this is where the difference between a child and an adult really comes in. Because Drew was essentially drawing a picture of a wolf. So now they weren't sure if this person could have been wearing a Halloween costume or what. It was just heartbreaking. Drew was telling the detectives that his mother was screaming over and over, even telling them to run and hide. And then it just stopped. While all this was happening, he went and hid. But poor Max was still in bed watching all of this unfold feet away from his mother. Drew knew this because when the man left the house, he got out of his hiding place. He went into his mother's bedroom where he found his mom lying lifeless on the bed and his brother covered in blood. And no, he wasn't using the type of words that I am. He was using the words of a 7-year-old. I'm just telling you what was relayed to these detectives. The first thing that crossed my mind is they spared the children. Whoever did this, they had such intense rage, it seems so personal, but at the same time, they don't want to harm the children and then they just leave? And these poor children, they were so terrified that they got together and they did exactly what their mom told them to do. They ran and they hid. Drew led his older brother Max into the bathroom. They locked the door. They climbed into the bathtub and they pressed themselves down, lying really still until it was safe to come out. That's why they didn't hear the police officers knocking on the window for some time and then finally heard their neighbor's voice, which was familiar, and that is why they came out. But they were traumatized. This affected them and would affect them for the rest of their lives. Max was talking before this incident, but after what he saw, he went back into a nonverbal state. And Drew had one last thing to tell officers. And this is the chilling part. They asked him if he knew who this man was. They came into the house and heard his mommy, not thinking they were actually going to get an answer. He said, "It's the man that knocks on the windows." How chilling is that? Of course, they want some clarification. Who is this man that knocks on the windows? But little Drew must have been spent because all he told them was that this was the latest he had ever been allowed to stay up at night. Detective Ed Judy remembers looking over at the clock and seeing that it said 1:41 a.m., and it just broke my heart. But that is all the information they had. At this point, the boys are actually handed over to Child Protective Services, even though their father lives nearby in Clearwater. The fact is, this person was wearing a mask. And that led the detectives to believe that the boys possibly knew who he was, and that's why he was hiding his identity. So one of the first suspects on their list was actually the boys' father, Don Halpin, Nikki's ex-husband. He lived close enough. They had a rocky relationship. He isn't present in the boy's life as much as she wished he could have been, and he didn't get full custody. Plus, he wasn't in control of the settlement funds. That right there was a motive. This one safe and quiet cul-de-sac was now full of police cars, yellow crime scene tape, officers, homicide detectives, and chaos. That's the scene Nikki's boyfriend Chris pulls up to that night. Yes, he was the one who called 911. At this point, everyone close to Nikki and her boys are persons of interest. Chris was told to go there and to make a statement, but this was also a chance for detectives to size him up. They think he could have followed Nikki back home. He could have been on his cell phone and been the one hurting Nikki all along and pretending that he was just an ear witness to the horror. They don't know. When Chris gets there, he's frantic. He jumps out of his car. He's yelling Nikki's name. He wants to know what's going on. He's asking the officers what happened. And of course, no one knows who he is at first. So they're telling him, you can't come through here. But then when he explains he was the one that called 911, the detectives decide to speak with him. Now, just for the record, Nikki's still in critical condition. She's been placed in a medically induced coma. She's in the ICU. And the local police are corresponding with police in Massachusetts to get officers to go over to Nikki's parents' house and notify them in person to let them know what's going on. But let me go back to Chris first. From his interview, we get times. 9:33 p.m., 5 minutes after Nikki left Chris's place, he gets that instant message from her name, which is Nikki's cooking. But she would have still been driving. So he asked her how she got home so fast. No answer, until she's actually home and back on her laptop. She responds with, "Hi, I didn't write that, so I better look around the house." Chris then typed, "Who wrote it then?" And Nikki told him, "I'm calling you." If we put this together with what Drew said, this is probably why Nikki was seen running back into her bedroom, because she took the cordless phone, which we know was sitting on the bed, and she's looking around the house because she was suspicious somebody was on her computer looking through her messages with her boyfriend. Chris told the detectives that Nikki was scared and she wanted him to stay on the phone with her while she looked around the house. Then he heard something like a closet door open, and that's when you could tell she must have encountered someone, according to him, because not only did she scream, but he could hear rustling around and he could hear a bunch of footsteps and running. And that is why he called 911 on his other phone while keeping her on the line so that he could still hear what was going on. Thankfully, he had 2 lines. Not everybody has 2 lines. I mean, nowadays, maybe you have you and your partner's line. But right away, Detective Judy feels like Chris could have done more if that's what really happened. He's trying to put himself in the same situation and thinking there is just no way that I would have stayed in my house on the phone with my girlfriend if I knew that someone I loved and cared about was potentially being attacked and she's screaming and she's got 2 little boys in the house. To the detective, this seems really odd. I mean, this man is on a cell phone. He can leave. So Detective Judy confronts Chris with all that information, and I do have the audio of what Chris said, but it was that he was afraid. He thought maybe someone was at his door too and about to attack him. And I was thinking, what? How would the intruder be in 2 places at once?
It was a definite struggle. And I picked up my cell phone with that on the phone and I called 911. I was actually scared at that point because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if somebody was outside my door looking for me too, something like that.
Chris moves up the list of people that could have done this to Nikki. They need more information. So they ask him if they can follow him back to his house and he could provide them with, the instant messages. And what was surprising to them is they ask him for his entire computer. And of course, they want to be able to download it and everything. They want to preserve evidence. And this man is hesitant to turn it over. But Detective Judy was pretty blunt with him. He's like, look, if you have nothing to hide and there's nothing suspicious going on here, there should be no reason for you not to want to turn over your computer. The thing about Chris is that I told you he was an engineer. It wasn't only his personal computer. He also used it for work purposes. And that seemed to be the hesitation. But they were like, we're going to get it back to you. Nothing will be deleted. And then he finally let them have it. Now that they have that squared away, they have to find out more about Nikki. And while all that's happening, local Massachusetts officers are showing up at her parents' front door. It's the middle of the night, almost 2,000 miles away. And her father, Nelson, gets out of bed. He answers the door, and her mother, who's still in bed, literally hears her husband almost screaming, "No, no, no." So she comes out, she looks, and she sees that it's an officer. And that's when she knew it wasn't good. And that's when she overheard the officer saying that their daughter, Nikki, had been brutally attacked and that she was still alive, but in critical condition. It was shocking. It's not what any parent expects or wants to hear. They also don't want to hear the next question that came out of the officer's mouth, but they needed to know. So they asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Nikki. And the first name that comes out of her mother's mouth was Don Halpin. She never cared for Don. He had given Nikki so much grief. They fought so much. They just went through a divorce. She said she would bet money that it was Don. And after this, Nikki's parents and her sister took the first flight they could to Florida as fast as they could to be by her side. Now, this made perfect sense to detectives. Once Lori had explained that Don would be the person in charge of that settlement money if Nikki was dead, that's $1 million motive. But the most important thing in this moment was getting to Nikki. Once in her hospital room, the shock really hit this family. Nikki's injuries were severe. She was intubated with a ventilator that was helping her breathe. In order to treat her injuries and facilitate medical procedures, Nikki's head had to be shaved, and bandages were carefully wrapped around her head. Her father looked at her and told his wife that this was not good, and Lori agreed. Nikki was on life support. Without these machines working to keep her alive, it didn't look like she was going to make it. To realize your child was just there, just living their life hours before this, and now this was the state that she was in, it's beyond devastating. It's unreal. And Lori didn't know what to think. I don't think your mind is fully able to understand what's going on in these moments. Like, I think the primal instincts take over and you have all these, hormones, endorphins, things going through your mind. You've got adrenaline. But her motherly instinct told her that all she needed to do in that moment is just hug her daughter. And that's what she did. She just hugged her so tight. She kissed her. She held on to her. And then she just started to sing. And when I listened to this, it almost brought me to tears. It broke me. It's just so unfair to me that someone else can play God and take away someone like this, someone that everyone loves so much. This poor mother. There was this song that her mom used to sing to her when she was just a baby. And the lyrics were simple. It was Nikki's Mama's Girl. And her mom would sing it over and over again. She would just hug Nikki in her hospital bed with tears just streaming down her face, knowing Nikki would never wake up, that life was never going to be the same. And in that moment, Lori did make a promise to her daughter. She said that she would live every single day for her. She wasn't going to leave her side. They were still holding on to some optimism. They were just hoping for a miracle. And meanwhile, back at the crime scene, these technicians are collecting all of the critical pieces of evidence for analysis. They're taking inventory of anything that seemed out of place, and they don't notice much. They don't see any signs that anyone broke into this house or forced entry. And they knew that he must have come through the front door because Drew even mentioned the man used the front door when he left. So they assumed that the intruder might have come in the same way. We'll get to more than that. There were no broken windows or other areas disturbed. So that right there led the officers to believe this was someone who knew this house or had access to it or that knew Nikki well enough they knew how to at least get inside. They were thinking maybe someone knew that she had a spare key. But this is what kept Nikki's boyfriend Chris and her ex-husband Don on their list. And 5 o'clock that morning, Detective Snipes and Ed Judy actually paid Don a visit out in Clearwater, which is only about a 25-minute drive from Nikki's. Don answered the door, and when given the news, he was clearly shaken. His first questions weren't even about himself. They were about his boys. They were about Max and Drew. Were they okay? Had they been hurt? And once the detectives reassured him that the kids were safe, they asked him to sit down. And he invited them in. They went to the kitchen table, and detectives asked Don about his relationship with Nikki since, they just got divorced. And he was honest. He admitted, it was very contentious. And they asked about that trust fund. He knew that she controlled it, but he insisted that he had no interest in that money. It was for his son. But he did admit he didn't always think that Nikki should be in so much control. It was as though he was saying that maybe she wasn't the most responsible person. And then they asked him the most important question. Where were you last night when Nikki was attacked? Don told them he had actually been at work. He was still bartending, and now he was working at Don Cesar Hotel in St. Petersburg on the beach, miles away from Safety Harbor. It is about a 45-minute drive. He said even the bar manager could vouch for him. And then he mentioned Nikki and other men. And that was pretty interesting. Almost like he resented Nikki for dating very soon after they separated when their divorce wasn't even official. He said she was seeing multiple men, meeting some online, getting into relationship after relationship, back to back, and he didn't seem very happy about it, especially with his boys being around all these supposed strangers. He was kind of bad-mouthing the dudes too, calling them obsessed and even going so far to call one of them like stalker status. Kind of seemed like he was pointing the finger and also degrading his ex-wife, who was now fighting for her life. Detectives left for now. They were going to check on Don's alibi and find out more about the men in Nikki's life. But sadly, things were looking worse when it came to her condition. The reality was that Nikki had no brain activity whatsoever. There was such a severe beating, and it was such a difficult situation for her loved ones because they were truly holding on that things would get better. But they were forced to confront the painful truth that the Nikki that they knew and loved, she was gone. Her body was there, but she wasn't Nikki anymore. And on January 11th, just after noon, Nikki's loved ones made a very heart-wrenching decision. They removed her from life support. And when they did, Nikki's mom sang to her again. And then she told her, "Off to sleep, my love." And that just broke my heart. If there could be one positive thing that we can look at, I will tell you that 11 people were able to live because Nikki's organs were donated. She was healthy when she passed away, and she went on to help save 11 people's lives because of that organ donation. It was so emotional when I listened to her sister talking about this. She was crying, and she said she'd been crying for days and days. But there was this moment that came. She was on the phone with a friend, and she was looking out the hospital window, and it was at night, and she kept seeing this helicopter land on the little hospital landing pad and then take off like every 10 minutes, back to back. She told her friend it was so weird that the helicopter just kept doing that, and it dawned on her that they had harvested her sister's organs that night, and that each one of those takeoffs was her organs going to be transplanted to save someone's life. Now, Jen wasn't sure, so she actually confirmed this with the hospital, and she was right. That is exactly what she saw. That was like the ultimate goodbye. It was so bittersweet because she gave life. She gave others a second chance when she did not have one anymore. The investigation intensified since now this was officially a homicide. Investigators were interested in every man that Nikki had been seeing or had been in contact with, so they interviewed her best friend Kim, who of course was completely devastated by Nikki's death. But she also knew how important it was to help any way that she could. She was the one that Nikki shared all of her secrets with. And she told detectives, starting with Chris, that Nikki was not serious about that relationship at all. It was just something to pass time, having fun together, getting to know one another. It was a new relationship, but at that point, it really wasn't progressing to a point where she was going to be exclusive. She was still seeing other people. However, she did say she thought that Chris wanted more of a commitment than Nikki did, at least at that point. Kim also said that Nikki and Chris would bicker about things. She would hear them, on the phone or even in person when they all hung out. So there was some tension there. There wasn't clarity on the context of these disagreements, but it could be due to Chris wanting more and Nikki still talking to other men. But Kim said no. Nikki did not flaunt her business or her dating life. Chris would never have known she was talking to anybody else. So he did not seem to have a motive. But they still had to rule him out, because they were suspicious of him giving the wrong address to the dispatcher. but that could be explained by the fact he wasn't familiar with the location. They still collected all of Chris's computers, his electronics, and he willingly let them come into his house and do an entire search of the residence. So they were able to conclude that he was not involved in her murder. He was exactly where he said he was. He was on his landline and his cell phone at his house, and records proved that. So Chris is ruled out. Kim provides another name, Brian. Kim said she was meeting Nikki out one night, and before she got there, Nikki called her and said, "I just met Jesus." It was a joke. To her, the guy looked like Jesus. He had long hair, a beard, a mustache, and Nikki and Brian had fun that night. They exchanged numbers, but the next day, Kim said that Brian was calling Nikki back to back multiple times over and over again, and he wasn't getting the hint that Nikki wasn't interested in seeing him again. So investigators feared that maybe Brian had become obsessed, and maybe he felt slighted by her, and maybe he's the man that was knocking on her windows. But investigators were once again able to rule him out based on phone records and GPS. He wasn't near Nikki's home that night, so Brian's ruled out. Next, Kim explained that Nikki regularly worked out at a local gym, and there was a guy there named Troy that would walk her out to her car, even though she never asked him to protect her or bring her outside. Investigators again wanted to make sure this guy wasn't stalking her or had harmed her. Troy wasn't even in town the night that Nikki was killed, so he too was ruled out. Now, another thing I wanted to point out was just because a woman is meeting new people, even casually dating or getting into a relationship and deciding it's not right for her, there's nothing inherently dangerous or wrong with that in and of itself, right? And even her best friend Kim was like, listen, she wasn't doing anything dangerous. She wasn't going home with a guy on the first night she met him. Not that that should be dangerous, but we have done enough cases to know that there are some risks to meeting strangers right away. But Kim wanted to clarify that her friend was responsible. She had children. She was definitely open to get to know someone, but she wasn't making reckless decisions. She wasn't just bringing a guy to her house with her children there before getting to know him. So this led investigators back to Don, someone she knew, someone who wouldn't have harmed his own kids and who would have worn a mask to hide his face. Friends of Nikki, including Kim, told the investigators they always found Don intimidating, and Kim went so far to call him the most aggressive person she'd ever met. Remember, he was a former correctional officer, but he was also a boxer who at one point even sparred with Mike Tyson. That detail alone painted a picture of someone that was capable of violence. Detectives checked, and sure enough, Don's boss confirmed he was 45 minutes away at the time of Nikki's murder. There was even CCTV footage showing Don was at the bar. He was fully cooperative. He even took a polygraph test, and he did pass for the most part. And I say it that way because they did find some deception when they asked one specific question. If he knew who harmed Nikki. That's interesting. But he had a reason why. He explained to them, "No, I don't know who did it, but I have a gut feeling about who it could have been." He explained when he was initially interviewed, he wasn't just necessarily pointing fingers. He was genuinely concerned because he told detectives that Nikki had confided in him that she was worried she had a stalker. Not just anyone, someone she knew. So the investigator's interest was piqued. Don explained that the only person he could think of that had given Nikki issues most recently was her ex-boyfriend, Dan Welch. Remember him? He was the one that didn't even want to be with her. He didn't want to get married. He wasn't ready. Well, first of all, Don is not a fan of Dan. He thought Dan was the reason that him and Nikki's marriage failed because they tried separation before their divorce. They wanted to see if they could mend things, but then Dan came along, and Nikki pushed forward and ended things with Don. But that's not why Don thought Dan was an issue. He told the investigators that after Nikki broke things off with Dan, things were okay for a while, but then Dan started to bother Nikki. And she didn't normally share her dating life with her ex-husband, Don, but it got so bad, she actually asked Don what to do. Don told detectives that Nikki had told him that she started noticing Dan was at the same locations that she was. like he had followed her there and he was watching her. And that's concerning because Dan didn't live in the same town. And then it was undeniable because one night, Nikki's out with her new boyfriend, Chris, and she noticed that Dan shows up at the very same place and he's watching them. So at this point, Dawn tells Nikki that if she's so worried, she needs to get a restraining order, but she didn't. So the investigators aren't sure that Dan was as much of a problem as Dawn thought. So they decide to ask Nikki's mom and her best friend Kim about what they thought about Dan. Nikki's mom, Lori, is surprised that they're even asking about Dan because she always liked him. She said he's really responsible, he has a good career, he's quiet, polite, and she really thought that Nikki and him were going to end up getting married and be together forever. However, she did explain that Nikki, starting back on last Christmas, so not this current one, but the one before, she really felt like the relationship wasn't progressing. And one of the reasons that she got upset is because she was really excited. Dan had told her that she was getting her something sparkly that year for Christmas. She thought it was going to be a ring, and it wasn't. She thought they were going to get married, that he was going to propose, and she was really let down. It was a beautiful diamond bracelet, but it's just not what she wanted. She didn't want expensive jewelry. She wanted a commitment. And then Kim tells the detectives that Dan was a really great guy, and she could tell that he genuinely loved the boys. However, that was before they broke up. And she's going to give them more insight into why Nikki was done. It wasn't just about a ring and a bracelet instead of getting married. It was concerns that Nikki had about Dan's intentions. Because over time, Kim explained that Nikki was getting concerned about the way that Dan would constantly ask her about the trust fund money from the settlement. It was none of his business. And she felt the more he mentioned it time and time again, the more it seemed like the real reason he was sticking around was because he wanted the money. And in September of just that year, 2003, Nikki decided it was time to break it off. They had been broken up for about 4 months when Nikki was killed. And in those 4 months, Kim explained that things got worse and worse. It started with a night out. It was Nikki and Kim doing their usual Friday night together. And while they were driving, they noticed Dan's car barreling towards them. He almost sideswiped them and forced them off the side of the road. They were terrified. Then Dan pulled up next to them on the passenger side, and when they stopped, he blocked Nikki in so she could not open her door and get out. So what did he want? He wanted Nikki. He wanted her back. But if he thought that this was the way to achieve that, he was wrong. That behavior showed Nikki instantly that Dan had another side of him, one that she did not trust around her children. And by that time, it was over. But the thing is, Dan wasn't done with Nikki. Not too long after this, Nikki called Kim in a panic saying that Dan was outside knocking on her front door, and she didn't want to answer because she wanted him to leave. She wanted him to think she wasn't home, so she hid. And now he was walking around outside of her house, knocking on all the windows. Knocking on the windows? Wasn't that what little Drew said? That there was a man that knocked on the windows and that he was the one that hurt his mommy? Well, when this was happening, when he was walking around the house knocking on the windows, Nikki was hiding and she told her best friend Kim to stay on the line with her, just like she did on the night she was attacked. She wanted Chris to stay on the phone as she looked around that house. Back when this was happening with Dan, Kim, of course, was concerned and she's like, should I call the police? Is it really this serious? Are you worried that he's going to do something to you? What do you think he wants? And Nikki said, that is not necessary. Do not call 911. She just wanted him to leave and to get the picture that she did not want to be with him anymore. She just wanted to move on peacefully. With this new information, detectives decide to drive over to 35-year-old Dan Welch's house, which was just 6 miles away from Nikki's. And the first thing that struck them as odd was when they asked if he knew Nikki, Dan was like, who? Really? They're like, Nikki, your ex-girlfriend? And he's like, oh, you mean Niccole? I've been waiting for you to show up. I just heard what happened today on the radio. And I was like, okay. He couldn't pick up a phone. I mean, I thought about what I would personally do if someone that I had just dated a few months earlier had been murdered. Would I call? Would I just, want to give them any information that I possibly could? What would you do? Do you find it weird if somebody doesn't take the initiative to reach out to the police department? I mean, maybe he was in shock. Maybe he really, truly had no information to provide. Or maybe it's a red flag. And I'm not a professional, but I think it would be a little suspicious to me the way he answered the door and pretended that he didn't know who they were talking about, especially if he said he just heard about it on the radio. But the detectives specifically were already focusing on Dan. This just added to the red flags in their perspective. But he invites them in, they sit down, and the detectives reiterate to him that they're here to talk about Nikki's murder. And they want to know if he could provide any information. But he didn't even have to say anything for the next red flag to pop up, because as the detectives are sitting there, they notice something. Propped up casually in the corner was a silver 5-cell Maglite flashlight. The kind that's long and heavy and could easily be mistaken for a baseball bat in the dark. When Detective Snipes looked at it, that's exactly what popped into his head. Drew being 7, he could have easily thought that it was a baseball bat in the attacker's hands. Now, because they can't take anything from this house, because they don't have a search warrant, they don't want to draw attention toward anything, including that flashlight, because they might want to retrieve it later when they do have a search warrant, and they don't want to spook Dan, because then he might get rid of it. But the detectives do kind of exchange a glance. And at this point, Detective Ed Judy, that's leading this interview, decides that maybe he's going to go a little easy on Dan, build a little rapport with him. So he just asked him about himself, about his habits. And then he kind of segues into asking him what he was doing on the night that Nikki was attacked. And Dan explained that he had been regularly going with his friend Larry on jogs and on bike rides for almost 20 miles at a time sometimes, maybe sometimes more, maybe sometimes less, because Larry was training for a marathon. And that night, Dan said, I got some Chinese food, I ate dinner, and then, like he regularly did, he went with Larry on one of those jogs and then bike rides. Afterward, he said he went home and he went to bed. Detective Snipes asked for Larry's phone number, they get it, and while Detective Judy is talking to Dan, he calls him and he corroborates that yes, they went jogging and biking. But Larry does say one thing that stood out to him that night was that Dan usually does the whole 20 miles. But that night, he told him he had a stomach ache and he had to go home early. They asked him what time that was, and he says it was about 9 p.m. So that was plenty of time for Dan to have made it over to Nikki's. And his friend Larry made sure to directly tell the detectives, I'm not going to be Dan's alibi. At that point, they asked Dan to come down to the station to make a formal statement. And also, because they want to get a DNA sample, fingerprints, which he agrees to, he provides them with DNA, he provides them with swabs, he provides them with fingerprints. And then they ask him about his relationship with Nikki. He casually mentions that he thought she was really attractive, but that he never really wanted a commitment with her. So, their relationship never went anywhere, and they both moved on. And as a matter of fact, he has a new girlfriend named Stephanie, and things are going really well. Detectives go one step further and they ask him if he would be willing to take a polygraph. And he says yes. These polygraph results were so bad, they were in the negatives. He scored a -19. So much deception was detected. But I'm sure most of you know, they're not admissible in court. So the reason they're still used is they are used to gauge whether or not detectives should move forward in a certain direction. And all signs were pointing to Dan. And he was really angry when they were telling him his results. He's like, I don't know why I scored the way I did because I didn't do it. And he was like, no, everyone's going to think I did. Everyone's going to think I'm a suspect and I didn't do it. I don't have a reason to hurt her. He was also acting like really buddy-buddy with the detectives. He even says, when you drop me back off, you can come search my entire house. And of course, they did take him up on that offer. And they go one step further. They're like, can we have our forensics team come in here? And he says, sure. But that's when something really weird happens. Something that personally made me really frustrated when I heard it. He gets a call from his girlfriend, and he doesn't even step away from the detectives. He answers, and the first thing he says to her is that, you're not going to believe this. I'm here with homicide detectives. They're at my house. They're waiting to search it because I'm their prime suspect. And I thought to myself, that's a really weird flex. He was almost bragging. It was even almost in a way to garner sympathy in that moment. He's pacing back and forth around the detectives, and apparently his girlfriend's asking him questions because he's answering. But of course, they can only hear one side of that conversation. So this is what was said. No, she wasn't robbed. Nothing was stolen. No, she wasn't raped. No, the kids were not hurt at all. Oh, no. Actually, she was bashed in the head. And these detectives were just sitting there stunned because, first of all, they never told him he was a prime suspect. And none of those things he told his girlfriend had ever been released to the media. Yeah. The detectives hadn't told him any of that. They asked him all the questions, but he never actually inquired about what happened to Nikki, the woman that he said he loved. And what struck me as very odd was the way that he used the word bashed. That's so insensitive. It is factual, but bashed? Just that word, it just, no. Someone that cared, I don't feel like they would say that. And around 10 p.m., the forensics team did show up. The detectives had specifically told them they wanted them to search for any dark clothing, a ski mask, anything that would be similar to what Drew described the attacker wearing. And they tore apart this man's closets, his dresser drawers, but there was a lack of any clothing like that. And I was thinking if they were searching my closet, it would be the exact opposite because almost all my clothing is black. But it was the lack of evidence both there and also at Nikki's house that was really perplexing. And another red flag. Nikki's house had no evidentiary value at all. They found no fingerprints. They found no foreign DNA. They had nothing concrete. And as they were leaving Dan's house, something happened. It was like one red flag after the next because Dan walks right up to Detective Judy and he's like, here. He hands him the flashlight and he's like, I know you want it. That is so weird. So weird. Who does that? But here's the thing. When the detective looks down, he realizes this is a 3-cell mag light. It's not the same flashlight that they saw when they entered that house. That was a 5-cell. This was a 3-cell. The other one was bigger and heavier. This one's skinnier. And this one was more of a gold color, not a silver. So this to them was a distraction. It was a decoy. It was deliberate. Now they had lost the opportunity to get the silver one, and they don't know where Dan put it. But he was right about one thing. He was now their prime suspect. Now that they had Dawn ruled out, he was actually given custody of his boys. And that was bittersweet. They were in such an emotional state. They were hardly talking. Drew was very upset. Max was really sad and scared, and they just shut down. Their 32-year-old mom, that they should have had so many more years with, was gone. These poor boys. They were up all night, every night with nightmares, and Don was doing his best as a single dad now to care for them and comfort them and ease their pain. He had a new routine where they would all fall asleep in the same bed, and he would have them watch cartoons before bed so that they would watch something funny as they drifted to sleep. That way it could ease their minds. But no one could believe that this was their new reality. And what was so frustrating to the detectives was that they really did now believe that Dan killed Nikki, but they had to prove it. And it was looking like that was going to be very hard at this point. He's completely free, and there was nothing they could do about it. All they had was suspicion, circumstantial evidence, not enough for them to arrest him, but enough to make the detectives very nervous. And for Nikki's family, her parents, her sister, her best friend Kim, they were now wondering if this man who they once smiled with, they joked with, that was in their house, had actually attacked Nikki in her room and took her life. And then a call comes in. It was unexpected, and it was from a woman, and she introduces herself as Stephanie Hayes, Dan Welch's girlfriend. She sounds really nervous, and she sounds upset, and she's like, listen, I feel like my boyfriend is trying to use me as an alibi, and that makes me feel really uncomfortable. And then she clarified. She says, I want to clear something up. I have been seeing Dan, but he keeps calling me his girlfriend, and that's not the truth. We're not in a serious relationship. We had just been casually hanging out before all this happened, and now he's acting like we're really serious, and I don't like it. I don't like the way that he's putting me in the middle of this investigation. She let them know that she got a phone call from him on the night that Nikki was killed. And she remembers exactly when that call came in, 10:14 p.m. And what stood out to her was that when she picked up the phone, right away she heard Dan's voice, and he was extremely out of breath. He was huffing and puffing, and he was breathing heavily into the phone. And she was like, what are you doing? She was thinking, why would he choose to pick up his phone when he couldn't even catch his breath yet? And he told her, oh, I'm sorry. I'm just loading some of my tools into the back of my van. But that was weird because he had already done that earlier in the day. Now she felt like he was really suspicious, and detectives did too. They started thinking about, remember how Dan said he was on his bike with his friend Larry? And he told them he was going home? Well, they don't think he went home. They think he turned right around and he headed to Nikki's on his bike. And then after he committed the crime, he had to hurry to get back to his landline, specifically his landline, so that he could prove that he was at his house. That's why he didn't wait to call Stephanie, and he was still out of breath from riding his bike as fast as he could. Now, coincidentally, Dan's friend Larry was training for a marathon. And Dan was right there by his side for weeks and weeks, getting his endurance up, practicing, going as fast as he could, possibly planning that bike ride over to Nikki's and back. I looked it up on Google Maps, and it said that it would have taken him approximately 24 minutes to get from his house to Nikki's. Larry said that the last time he saw Dan was at 9:02 p.m. And by 9:30, Chris got that instant message that said HB from Nikki's laptop. That was enough time for Dan to get there. About 10 minutes later, Nikki was on the phone with Chris, and moments afterward, she was being attacked, and he's calling 911 still before 10 p.m. And even though it would have taken on average 24 minutes to get from Nikki's and then back to Dan's house, he has been training. He could have probably made better time. It's only 4.9 miles away. He's used to going on 20-mile bike rides, and his bike would have been way less obvious than a car speeding away from the scene. And not only that, Stephanie said that when she was at his house before the murder occurred, she remembered seeing a mask, a ski mask. And it only made her feel uncomfortable because, well, first, why would you be wearing that in Florida? But also because now, when she found out more details about the case, she realized that he was in possession of a mask that could have been the same as the killer's. And detectives thought that this was just even more proof that he got rid of a ski mask, because remember, they didn't find one in his possession. They also were never able to find that 5-cell mag flashlight either. Stephanie agreed to have her phone tapped. And she had multiple conversations with Dan trying to get him to talk about the ski mask or why he was out of breath, but he would give her these very vague answers. He just wouldn't fall for the bait. Still, now detectives have a mode of transportation and more evidence that Dan was involved. On January 12th, the medical examiner's autopsy report came out. Nikki's cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head. And her specific injuries, I'm just going to read them directly from this report. There was a laceration over her left eye, a laceration over her left ear, a large laceration behind her left ear, and to the left ear with sections of her ear missing. There were abrasions to the back of her head, a bruised area of the outer left shoulder, a bruised area on the outer left bicep, a bruised area on the left forearm, a bruise to her left collarbone, a large area of bleeding found inside the skull on the right side. This was a violent attack. But Dan had no criminal record, and on paper he only had maybe a few traffic tickets. So he did not look like a murderer whose behavior was escalating. No arrests, no domestics in the past. So detectives felt like it was going to be harder for them to convince a jury that this normal citizen with no criminal record just became a murderer and killed his ex. It's not unheard of, but they may not convince a prosecutor to even go forward with the case. But then, luckily and coincidentally, a woman gets arrested for selling substances, and it was actually prescription medication, oxycodone. And she turns on her dealer, who happens to be none other than Daniel Welch. So he wasn't as squeaky clean after all. He gets arrested on the drug charges, he's indicted, and ultimately lands him in prison for 3.5 years. At the very least, the detectives on Niccole's case feel good about this. Good about the fact that he is now behind bars, and now they can build a case against him. Plus, this gives them more credibility since now he does have a criminal record. They feel like they are at least one step closer. But still, they're lacking any direct evidence. Meanwhile, the detectives are diligently having all of their interviews that they've done with persons of interest and suspects, as well as all the phone calls they've had with various witnesses, family members, and friends, all transcribed. This is for future court records. It's also for posterity and because it's just part of the case file. It's normal procedure. There is a professional whose job it is to pay close attention and transcribe every word that's being said on all of those recordings. And in this case, that was Genevieve Myers. And she took her job very seriously, as she should, because it is imperative that you get things right. Her job was to sit at her desk, put her headphones on, and type out interviews, wiretaps, and 911 calls word for word. She does this day in and day out, and this has been her job for nearly a decade. Lots of experience. This was over a month after Nikki's murder, and she is still transcribing recordings, and she finally gets to transcribing Chris's 911 call. It's the very last and maybe the most important recording of all. But at the time, she didn't know just how important this recording would be. And you know that Chris was hearing all of that too at the time, and he didn't know that his girlfriend wasn't going to survive. But he was hearing her being brutally attacked. He was hearing her screaming. He was hearing her struggle. And now Genevieve was hearing that too. She said it was the most chilling thing she had ever listened to, someone being killed. But more than that, she hears a male's voice. But it's not Chris's voice, because it's coming from the open line that Chris had on speaker. Remember, he's on with 911 on one of his phones, and he's on the other phone on speaker listening to Nikki. Well, not only did that recording catch what was happening to Nikki, but it caught her killer's voice. Now, if you weren't listening intently, you might have missed this. Genevieve said that she'd always heard people say that the hair stood up in the back of their necks, and this time, hers really did. And that's because, as she's listening to this crime taking place, she said it was the most chilling thing she'd ever heard, listening to someone being killed. And she clearly hears the killer say, "Niccole, calm down." She played this portion over and over again, and that's when the hair really did stand up on the back of her neck, because she recognized this voice right away. This was Dan Welch. He had a certain tone to his voice, she said, and she knew that because she spent over 100 hours transcribing all those interviews I told you about, the phone calls recorded between Dan and Stephanie. And there were hours of Dan talking to detectives, even complaining when he was in that interview room for hours. She could tell right away it was Dan Welch. She transcribed all those other recordings before she had a chance to transcribe the 911 call. But that was a good thing, because had she heard it first, she may not have made the connection. It wasn't just the tone. He was the only person that called her Niccole. And it just gives me chills, because I remember back when the officers came to his door and they were like, "Do you know Nikki?" And he was like, "Who?" And he's like, "Oh, you mean Niccole." Genevieve knew from listening to everything that she did that all of Nikki's friends and her family members called her Nikki. He was the only one that said Niccole. The investigators listened to that portion of the tape time and time over and over again, maybe 10, 20 times. And they could hear it too, but they wondered if this was going to be convincing enough for an arrest or a conviction. The detectives weren't sure, so then they had the audio professionally enhanced. Niccole's loved ones listened to it, and they too said it was Dan. But what was even more convincing is that Dan's own sister came forward and she actually requested to hear this tape. They were like, "There's no way that she's going to admit it's her brother, even if it is." But they were surprised and shocked when she said yes, that she'd known Dan for her entire life. And not only was that his voice, but she said that was the maddest that she had ever heard him. At this point, he's in custody at the Florida Department of Corrections located in Lake Butler, Florida. They go get him, they take him out of his prison cell, they transport him back to Pinellas County, where he faced first-degree murder charges and armed burglary for entering Nikki's home with the intent to commit a crime inside. This didn't just happen overnight, though. This was January 2006, 2 years after Nikki had been murdered. And finally, on May 18th of 2007, with Nikki's family's approval, prosecutors offered this monster a plea deal. Dan Welch pled guilty to the lesser offense of second-degree murder in exchange for avoiding a long, drawn-out trial. He knew he wasn't going to win, though. He had heard the recordings, he saw all the evidence. He knew he wasn't going to win. From everything they gathered, the detectives truly believe that after he went on the bike ride with Larry, the night that Nikki was attacked, he immediately drove all the way to Nikki's. Now, they still don't know how in the world he got inside her house. There could have been a spare key, or he could have, they believe, possibly gone through her garage. But he did get inside. And he was the one that left that instant message that just said HB for Chris. They don't know if it was an accident or if it might have been some kind of secret message. We will never understand what it was for. But when Chris responded back and asked how Nikki got home so quickly, unfortunately, Dan knew in that moment that she would arrive back at her house any minute. So he hid in a closet waiting for an opportunity to jump out. And when it presented itself, he attacked Nikki, and it was all caught on that 911 call. I could not believe, as he's attacking her, this poor mother who's trying to get away, trying to tell her kids to run so that she could shield them from what was happening. He says, Niccole, calm down. It's pure evil. And what did he get? 25 years in prison. For Nikki's family, it was a gut punch. On one hand, it meant no trial, no forcing Max and Drew to relive that night in all the excruciating details. But on the other hand, 25 years felt like a slap in the face. Kim, Nikki's best friend, said, he'll get his freedom back and Nikki won't. In her victim impact statement, Nikki's mom looked directly at Dan and said, you beat her and beat her right in front of her kids. How could you? Her voice was cracking, but she also had the strength of a mother who had lost everything to look at this man who didn't even respond. He didn't apologize. The only explanation his attorney actually offered was that he wanted to spare the boys a trial. That's why he admitted to guilt. But Nikki's family doesn't buy it. They believe he took the deal because the evidence was stacked too high against him. The voice on the tape, the eyewitness accounts from Drew, the red flags that he couldn't shake. After the sentencing, Don, Nikki's ex-husband, the father of her children, said what many were thinking. It was premeditated. It wasn't just a crime of passion. He believed that Dan deserved far more than 25 years. Nikki's loved ones had her ashes, and they planned to spread them all the places that she loved to ski. Her family also started the first Massachusetts chapter of Parents of Murdered Children. It was a way to honor her and to help others. Her mother also said she put a candle in her window and she had promised to keep it lit until she got justice for her daughter, and now she could finally turn it off. That summer, Don took the kids back to Massachusetts. They visited the chapel where he and Nikki had been married and a family vacation spot where they had once been so happy. And together, him and the boys scattered some of her ashes there as a way for her to go back to all the places that she loved. When they returned to Florida, Don did something that maybe some would think is weird and very unexpected, but he moved the boys back into the house where Nikki had been killed. It did seem impossible at first, but then he noticed something. The boys seemed lighter. They would open up more. They would smile. They would tell stories about their mom. And that house wasn't just holding on to trauma. It was holding on to her. And Don said that he realized that for Max and Drew, this wasn't a crime scene. It was the home that their mother had chosen specifically for them. It was the home where she loved them, where they had so many memories. And he wanted to keep that connection. Today, they're all grown up. And they survived and they thrived. And I've heard interviews with them. They seem like amazing little boys who love their mother so much. The things they said about her were so beautiful. They just adored Nikki. And Nikki's friends and family members remember her for her smile, her love, her energy that filled every room. And they remember her as a mother who fought for her sons every single day of her life. And even in her final moments, she did what a mother would do. She protected them. She told them to run and hide. I absolutely can't even imagine having to make choices like that in my final moments. And I'm so thankful for all of you who are here to hear me talk about stories like Nikki's. I appreciate it so much. And also appreciate so much all the sponsors that help me make these videos possible. So please don't forget to support our sponsor for today's video, which is June's Journey. You can download it for free by clicking the link below in the description box or scanning the QR code on the screen. And thanks again to June's Journey, and thanks again for being here for Nikki's story. I will see you in my next video. Bye.